Hi, this is Pastor Steve with an encouraging word. This week we've been looking at ordinary time in which most of us live. When maybe some big things are happening, which we need lots of grace or need a big miracle. But for most of the things we'll face this day, we just need ordinary grace, ordinary miracles, things to help us keep walking with the Lord, grace to help us in the day-to-day needs we face. I think of God's promise in Lamentations chapter 3, verses 21 and 22, where it says, "The steadfast love of the Lord never changes. His mercies, they never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is God's faithfulness." Each day, God gives us the grace that we need. They are new every morning, His mercies, His gifts to us. And so we can expect as we go through the day to encounter grace, to receive help, to be aware of God's presence. Maybe not in some big way, but often in the little ways. I think of the great miracle of Moses seeing the burning bush. He turned aside to see, and there was a burning bush, a bush that was not consumed. And from it he heard the voice of God saying, "Moses, take off your shoes, you're on holy ground." We may not always be aware of when we're on holy ground, but God promised to be with us day by day. We may not see a burning bush, but we can catch glimpses of His presence, awareness of His grace, because He's promised to be faithful to us. Jesus had words to say about this in the Sermon on the Mount. Let me read you from chapter 7, starting in verse 7. "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the doors will be open. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Which of you, if a child asks for bread, would give them a stone? Or if they ask for a fish, would you give them a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask Him?" Good gifts for those who ask Him. Grace for the day. I always tell people that God doesn't give grace for 1,001 things that could happen, things we imagine or worry about, but He will give grace for what does happen. His faithfulness extends moment by moment each day. We, United Methodists, have an expression for this, means of grace, that God has many means to give and convey His grace to us. Certainly we think about reading the scriptures, as I read just a few moments ago. Words of encouragement, words of hope, a promise to stand on, to ask, to seek, to knock, knowing that God will help us find and answer and receive. We know too that another means of grace is prayer. In praying to God, we know we often receive the grace we need, a word of assurance, a stillness in our heart. Sometimes God's grace is conveyed through the phone call of a friend, an email, a text message. A friend of mine talked about one time he received God's grace through a TV advertisement, talking about help in times of need. And his mind went from the insurance company on the screen to the God of heaven who promised to help him in his time of need. Means of grace, of course, come through worship. That's why it's important to participate in worship, whether online as we're sheltered or outside, the bypass campus, or maybe inside at one of the other services. We can be there in person and still be safe and, again, experience sometimes the grace we need. Means of grace are varied because God's grace is varied. God loves to give grace to His children, loves to let us know that He loves us and that He's with us. I don't know, again, what you're facing this day. Probably the normal things of a phone call that may be unexpected, maybe awaiting news from a doctor, maybe your lumbago's acting up again. Maybe it's just the fact that sometimes you get discouraged. We can know that God will give ordinary grace for our quite ordinary needs. He is faithful. His mercies are new every morning. has promised to be with us. And in many different ways, if we'll but pay attention, if we'll but ask or knock or seek, then we'll experience what God will give us. And it'll make a difference for today. Help us live into tomorrow. And that's a word of encouragement today from Pastor Steve.